Good evening and welcome everyone to the Midland Hotel. Tonight we're going to be putting patient centricity on trial. Clinical trials are broken and only patients can help us fix them if we let them. Today, 40 million patients are needed for over 300,000 clinical trials worldwide. And clinical trials are the lifeblood of medicine. Yet we're struggling for numbers, and without effective recruitment, the cost of producing the next generation of drugs soars. This year's Thought Leadership campaign explores how bringing the patient experience front and centre in clinical trials could actually revolutionise trial design, retention and recruitment, ultimately improving outcomes. This evening, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be hosting a focus group to meet with patients, caregivers, healthcare professionals and industry experts to discuss the current state of clinical trials. No further ado, I think we should crack on with the first question. And the first one goes to Professor Andrew, if I may, Andrew. Please tell us why you consider clinical research important and what inspires and motivates you to improve the experience for patients.
We're not going to improve healthcare, at least the treatment of healthcare or the prevention or the understanding with clinical research. You can do as much basic research in the laboratory as you want. We often do the early development of things by trying to reproduce the human being. But the human being is probably the best animal to work on. They behave like a mammal. They're a relatively normal mammal. You don't have to keep them and preserve them. They survive themselves. They look after themselves. They'll turn up to things on their own. You don't have to transport them in any particular shape or form. They'll generally do as they're told, unlike mice and other things. So in fact, it should be easier to do clinical research than it does to do laboratory research, because you don't have to do all these sorts of things. And that's where the answer is. We can develop so many things in the lab, most of them don't work. And we don't know why they don't work. Maybe the models that we use don't reproduce it. At some stage we need to move into the clinic, but we're not really taking advantage of the research that we can do in the clinic, because only a small proportion of patients go on into any clinical trial. None of the data that exists in healthcare systems is recorded. And with the granularity that we're facing, that we understand in the diversity of the human and the diseases that they develop, we're going to need those numbers in the future. So they're sitting somewhere in repositories or in databases that can't be connected, can't be brought together, and there's a wealth of knowledge just sitting there. And this is not something that's happened historically over centuries. This is a new, modern environment. In the past, say, surgeons 100 years ago would do something and they would try something different and something would work, and then they would start doing that. Whereas now you can't do anything even remotely different without at least 18 months of paperwork and all sorts of impediments in the way, which many of them are reasonable and sensible, but it's always like, hey, why are you guys doing this? You're evil and we're going to prevent you from doing evil. Or we can't give you these different, we can't allow doctors to give different medications on the basis of, when somebody's out of options, because they're going to do something really bad. And it's sort of the Saatchi discussion in the Saatchi bill. So clinical research is where your answers are. We're struggling to do it for all sorts of impediments that are difficult and hard to understand. But that's what's going to make the difference. Nothing in the laboratory, unless we know if it's going to work, is worth anything.
Nick, from your perspective as a former clinical research associate, how do you think we can improve the experience in your own, using your own experience? What can we do to make life better for the patients, if you like, during clinical trial?
So as a CRA, I focus mainly on oncology studies, so I might have a slightly different idea of some clinical trials more than anything. But I think when a patient's initially told, like anyone, that they've got cancer and then these are your options, and then there's clinical trials and these are all your options too. I think it's such a it's a minefield for everyone that they don't really know what to do, and then they're put in front of them like information about the trial drugs that may not make sense to them because they've not got medical backgrounds, scientific backgrounds, and I think doctors and nurses and everyone are so busy that they kind of give this information and it potentially loses the interest of the patients because they don't necessarily understand it, or they're scared of trialling something new. And I think it's just got to be a little bit, and a lot of time people don't know about, I don't think anyway, about trials until they're told about it and then they're poorly. And I think it's just quite a lot to take in for someone that's just been newly diagnosed with potentially anything.
Sammy, I'm keen to find your perspective, perhaps from a younger point of view, maybe younger patients. Do you feel that we can improve a younger person's understanding of clinical trials at all?
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, I work with a group called Generation R, which is a young person's advisory group. So the young people that I work with are very well informed. But I think it needs to sort of be a bigger picture. We only ever hear about it when things really go wrong. And I just think that if the key to getting to a young person is through social media and through the television. And we see so many interesting programs on television that we might not watch, but the young people think are fantastic. But if somehow we could get some really key people to talk about research and to talk about why it's good and why young people should be involved, I think that would make a difference. They need some sort of influencer
to
get
like
through to them.
On channels like YouTube or things like that?
Definitely, yeah definitely.
That's interesting. Well, have you got any thoughts on that, Mark, particularly on how we can actually get sort of people to get an interest not only in clinical trials but improve their general experience?
Yeah, I think to sort of touch on, I think awareness is a big problem. It's often trials are promoted or talked about when they exist.
Yep.
When we're looking for a specific person for a specific trial, but it's a bit, if you think of every other consumer brand and how they communicate with people and how we learn about things, we don't learn that cars exist the moment we need to get a car.
That's very true.
We sort of, there needs to be time and for education and for awareness that trials exist, what they are. I think there is just a general problem with awareness as a whole, but the people that are aware often think of students going on early phase trials, getting paid a few quid to go on something.
Yep.
And I don't think they understand the reality that there's not a single drug that people are using that didn't go through a trial, and that you can't get new medicines without trials. And I think there's this negative perception, I guess, that comes from what people see in the newspapers they read about pharmaceuticals and about how things work, that we really need to tackle. And I think avoiding the conversation and just waiting to that point is too late, and it needs to, I think, like Sammy sort of touched on, getting people to come out and talk about it is really important.
I agree, thanks for that.
And schools should play a huge part in that as well. I know that lots of the schools just do the sort of small tokenistic, we've told them about research, but it's just nowhere near enough. It's nowhere near in depth as it needs to be.
Well, move on to a second question. And I'm going to ask Tapas, Vernon and Vicky on this side about this particular question. It's you guys who answers it. What would you consider to be some of the biggest barriers to the public and patients becoming involved in clinical research, as a general rule?
I think some of them are frightened following the GDNF documentary, for example, now, because that's really put a lot of people off in the bulky world.
Do you want to briefly explain to the panel what happened?
Okay, so I don't know if you saw the recent documentary about the miracle cure for Parkinson's, but I was one of the first 6 who was accepted onto a trial, and I found that trial myself. Didn't get put on it through my consultant or anything, but it involved having 8 hours of brain surgery to fit some intricate plumbing, and then monthly infusions straight into our brain. And it did work. I improved 63%, so that for me was huge, but it didn't meet its outcome. It was filmed over 7 years, so there's the drugs, although it worked, the trial failed because it didn't meet its outcome, and it could have done a lot of good for a lot of people. And now we're trying to raise the money to get it up and going, but it won't be government, it will be all through, it won't be NHS, it will be all private sector stuff, and I don't know, they've seen what we've gone through, and it's pretty horrific, and who's going to sign up for that?
Exactly. Tap.
I think one of the things that I would say is similar to what a lot of people on the table are saying, that I applaud Vicky for getting on the trial herself, because I wonder how people become aware of trials sometimes. My own experience from being in hospital was that sometimes people relied on me to tell others about their trial, but we obviously have selection criteria, entry criteria, which sometimes means that the person you see may not be realistic for a trial because they're pregnant, or they smoke, or they're old, or they're from a certain ethnic background. And it means that the chance of me being able to find the right patient in my clinic, if you're busy and so on, is quite slim. And often a conversation that I perhaps myself, and I imagine this applies to many doctors as well, perhaps I was not the best person to have that conversation. We are taught certain things very well. I would say breaking bad news is something that is rehearsed very well, training for emergency situations. But how to talk to somebody about recruitment onto a trial is something that you do learn, but perhaps much later in your medical life. And a word words that I often heard from patients was that, even jokingly, but it worries me to be a bit of a guinea pig, perhaps, a common phrase. And I think, similar to perhaps what I think Nick was saying earlier, that we do need to focus on offering a good experience so that the uncertainty or the feeling of being probed and tested is kept to a minimum.
I was just going to build on those things. Fundamentally, motivation, trust, relationships. So we've talked a bit about acquisition and finding and educating patients, but you only think of clinical trials, if you've got to the end of your treatment, or you're only motivated as an individual at the end to do, and that for what reason? That's to find a potential new option for yourself. It isn't about providing scientific knowledge. So the way we need to talk about things is about health and wellness rather than that sickness model, and that's about the relationships. And it's about people's expectation and trust. At the moment, we have big problems with trust, whether it's the industry, the pharmaceutical industry, or even death of the expert, death of the medical expert, because Dr. Google can sort me out. No, when actually we all know when things really hit the fan, you go and see an expert. We need to communicate more inclusively and more effectively, and that means about people's experience. Yeah. Why do clinical trials have to be dull and boring to be involved with them? Yes, we want to avoid bias, and yes, we want to avoid confounding problems with the science, but why does it have to be dull and dry, or lack of it's the lack of communication. We expect patients to be on trial for months and months and months, years potentially, and they hear nothing back other than it's very one-sided.
Can I just bring Max in here, Max? Then you mentioned dull and boring trials. Surely, in what you do, Max, with your Sea Hero Quest and your gaming platforms, surely this is going to be a brilliant chance for you to make the patient experience much more enjoyable. What are your views on that?
I think it's totally possible. I think that the process of, I have a limited understanding of clinical trials from a game design background, but I think that with my work with Sea Hero Quest, which is a consumer-focused video game that collects data for scientific research, I think...
Is that specifically for dementia?
Specifically for Alzheimer's dementia, yeah. That particular project has led me to believe that you can create something that is really open and transparent about a subject matter which is fairly harrowing, still provide enjoyment in the process of collection of the data, and actually let people know how the research is going on afterwards, which I think kind of could align with some of the things that you are all talking about.
I think it would certainly get away from the dull and boring thing
Yeah.
that people think often happens.
Or one-sided. The fact that you've got, you're part of that game, you're part of that community, and there's a two-way or multi-way communication, as well as doing something for yourself.
The game does a lot of the work as well. I think the process of capturing the data is fun, and I think people then go away feeling as well that the participation wasn't boring in itself. The actual process of capturing the data was even enough payment for even being involved in the first place.
Andrew, you had a point.
Yeah, so just with permission to build on what you were saying, there's one element that I'm thinking about, and this is the loss of the value and the value disconnect. So the individual participants on trial are not feeling they're the most valuable things of the whole proposition, yet they lose their value. It's as if it's like Freakonomics. They're just being harvested and used for all other different aspects, and they've just lost the value piece. And there's plenty of value for being a participant in a clinical trial. There could be potentially direct benefits, and you could actually add to that thing. Many of the trials that we run, if it's working, we'll continue to supply the drug. In the oncology space, and sometimes it's difficult to have those discussions. But then you also think about the value for your community, the value for your population, and the value for your genetic makeup. We already have different regulatory bodies who won't approve therapeutics in their area unless it's their population or a diverse population which is representative. So the FDA will not approve therapeutics that are positive and approved by the Chinese FDA because they say they're racially different. And there are scientific reasons to support that in some of the ways therapeutics are metabolized, but that's just a broad context. So I think really understanding the value for the potential participant, building on that value for them, I think there's an important element there. So you're starting to feel that this is good for me, not just being a guinea pig. This is actually.
I think this is a big point for you, wasn't it, Vicky, in your trial? Because obviously the ultimate trust, I think, is to undergo brain surgery for the benefit of medical science, which you did. Did you feel at all you weren't valued as a...
Towards the end I did. Sadly, I think there was such, I don't know, everybody just lost motivation, I think, including the staff. But I still have a lot of respect for the main consultants on that trial, and I still have great faith in that, and I have faith in the team, and I'm not ready to let it go yet.
Claire, we haven't heard from you yet.
Well,
so
I was just going to build on the point about value as well. I think there is actually a lot of appetite to get involved in research. I think people see it. It's probably more of a growing trend. Like when you look outside of healthcare and pharma, people are more and more interested, not just in personal benefit, but how can you create this collective benefit, and almost like this sense of altruism that you can bring through it. And I think it's almost sad in a way that you've got this growing appetite and hunger to get involved, but at the same time you've got this disconnect and this poor experience, and not being able to bring those two together. Which is being seen in that recruitment and the awareness piece.
Brings me nicely on to another question. Do you think there's a negative perception of trials, and if so, why? Sammy?
I think there is. I've done a lot of sort of advocacy work in Liverpool, in not just Alder Hey, but at the Royal. And sort of people see you standing there with a board and leaflets and smiling and wanting to talk to them about research, and they either look the other way or they come up and say, well, I don't think that'll be for me. And again, I think it just goes back. Everybody thinks it's not for them. It doesn't involve them when we can all be part of it.
They want the benefits.
Yes.
But they don't want to be the participants, which is about
yeah.
flipping it around, about the value. Mm-hmm. So we talk about personalising medicine, right? The N of one trial, the approach of the N of one. But you have to be in the system to be treated as that N of one. So there's this massive disconnect between this potential versus actually, I'll let somebody else's data deliver those solutions to me.
It's also a misconception, right? I think the majority of people think that clinical trials are only for people that are living with a condition.
And I think as well, it's not always that they don't want to. I think it's that they don't think that they're valuable. And I've done quite a lot of outreach work to get parents of children who have been, who are involved with clinical trials, who've got long-term conditions, we've now got a really good active parent focus group at the hospital advising on clinical trials to make sure that they're designed in the right way. But there were lots and lots of parents from quite tough parts of Liverpool who thought, no, I can't come, my opinion isn't valuable, when it really is.
That's a big factor, isn't it? People not valuing themselves.
Absolutely.
Regardless of the fact whether they're valued by any clinical trial at all. Mark, what are your thoughts? Is there a negative perception on clinical trials?
I think there is, and I think it comes from, the industry avoids talking about it publicly because there's some kind of negative challenges with it. So it's left really to the news and the press, which really their job is to find negative things and report them in all areas, not just in science. So what I think a lot of people see is they either see where there's been problems or where there's been potentially what you'll hear from a lot of people. Certainly, my background's not from science. I come from consumer brand, and I've kind of come over and kind of discovered this. So I've gone through a process talking with many non-scientific friends and family, and almost having the same conversations and changing perceptions as I change my own. And I think there's this kind of understanding that it's just students just kind of going there and kind of doing trials. I think also you'll see that there'll be a big discovery when there's kind of been the initial molecule found, or the beginning process of this 10-year approval process. It's published in the press, there's the cure to something, and then there's almost like, well, I read about that thing, why is it not here? Is pharma somehow withholding this from me? Yep. And really it's the fact that the discovery is the beginning of the process to get it to the people that need it. And I don't think there's enough awareness of the process. I certainly knew nothing about how trials worked. I knew nothing about what it is. And now the simplistic way that I try and think about it is that every single drug that we have access to today is between 5 and 10 years out of date. Yeah. There's brilliant science that's been happening over that time, and it's our job to be able to get that to people. And actually clinical trials, for many people, are the only option they have to get access to medication that many people will know is the opportunity to help them. I guess in Vicky's case, people knew that it was an opportunity to help people, but the system and the regulations, rightly, have a long period of time for us to be able to get that to people.
I'm going to throw a question out to the floor, and it's not in the list, but I just think, do you feel, and I'm going to start with Andrew actually, right, and then open it up to the floor. Do you think the length of time that clinical trials can potentially take is a factor? Because Mark mentioned 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, so there's two elements. That's part of it, but there's a balance between the commercial, the ROI for the therapeutic, the length of patent life remaining, as to how long it gets to the answer, and the sort of signal differential you're looking for, and what sort of return you'll get from that from a pharmaceutical perspective. That sort of leads to the question that hasn't been asked in a broad forum of patients, people, the community in general, is what benefit are you seeking from the drugs that are being developed? Most of the therapeutics being developed now, at least for cancer, have an incremental effect, and that's why we've had massive clinical trials, because in order to detect the sort of differences we need to do 3, 4, 5, 6, 800 patients. Is this what we want as a community? We've got so many drugs. We've gone in cancer from a time there were only 5 or 6 drugs, trying to combine them, getting a bit of an incremental benefit. Now there are literally thousands. How do you combine them? That makes 1 million possible combinations. If you put 3 together, that's 1 billion, and then you vary the doses and the schedules and the timing, and there's literally quadrillions of possible variations. Yet the market is determined by the regulators and the ROI, whereas the participants should be asked, what are you looking for? And for pancreatic cancer, one of the biggest criticisms when we ask them through the Pancreatic Cancer Action Network at one of the patient fora is that, what are you looking for? And they said, we don't want some incremental benefit of a drug. Yeah. We want something that's really going to potentially make a big difference. And as soon as Merck started advertising Keytruda, they would come and say, I don't want standard of care, I just want Keytruda, because look how great it's doing. And so it's asking, well, what are we actually looking for? Because the smaller your benefit, the more the drug costs, and then it's less likely to be approved. And then how do you predict who's going to benefit ahead of time. And that difference is not every patient benefiting a little. It's a small proportion of patients benefiting a lot. But you can't predict that ahead of time, and you're guessing.
Nick, is this something you've experienced as well over the years? Or?
A lot of cancer trials are potentially when other things have been tried and tested and it doesn't work. And so maybe this is the last resort for them, I don't know. And then if the drug doesn't work, or bearing in mind that chemotherapy in itself it makes you particularly ill, and then you've got this added problem on top, and then you've got the visits, it's just, I think, just a concern probably for patients that there's this length of time that they've got to be taking this drug, and throwing in loads of visits, and just maybe the way like the protocol's written, it's got to be written for a reason and to protect the patients and everything like that. But sometimes it seems quite unreasonable to expect these poorly patients to be doing that many visits. And maybe, again, that's maybe why there's a negative perception of trials, is because patients don't necessarily want to commit to that time. And
it is an awful long time. I mean, sorry to interrupt. Vicky, how long did you say you're on it?
I had my surgery in February 2013 and my last infusion, because my tube's blocked, in 2016, September.
It's a massive commitment.
And it was every month going to Bristol from Newcastle, so...
Wow.
But if you flip that as a risk-benefit analysis, so you get a 63% improvement.
I would have gone to the moon and back.
And
yeah, exactly.
Then
Yep.
it's always a risk-benefit analysis. So the biggest problem in the running trials in the United States is trial shopping. So they'll go to a trial. If they get randomised to the control arm, they'll pull out of the trial, go to another site until they get onto the active therapeutic. So the randomised control trials in cancer are going to be a thing in the past, but we can't get past how we detect changes early. And probably the worst thing for patients with cancer is that you need to wait 3 or 4 months till your next scan. And as a patient, many of them will know, I'm feeling worse, I'm not getting any better. But you've got to wait 3 or 4 months, and then they go, well, we're not sure, go for another 3 or 4 months. And you go, oh gosh, it's not working at all. What do we do now?
And then on top of that, I think as well, like with the inclusion-exclusion criteria, there's a period of time that they have to have been off treatment for certain drug types, and like you say, that adds more time. And
the comment we used to make is that the only way you can get onto the protocol is if you've got one blue eye and one green eye. I mean, even if all the patients, all of them turned up into a room particularly for some of the harder cancers to treat, still only 5% of them will be eligible, because it's just trying to get your best patients to give you your signal for the regulator to look at so your therapeutic gets approved.
It also all really seems to come back all of the time to communication, doesn't it, with the patients? Everything is communication. And if we're not informing people in the right way, and if we're giving them, we've got to give them a realistic picture, haven't we? Like you said, there's not going to be a magic cure if they take this trial necessarily.
But I'd say it's two-way. We know you get better science if patients are involved. I mean, just coming back to that idea of what matters most to patients. So the value frame, the way we assess cost effect. So does a drug work clinically? Does it improve something? That's fine. You can assess that scientifically. But then you've got to work out, is it cost effective within the health system? And the value frameworks, these new ways of assessing it, can only work if you bring patients in, because what clinicians want to do is avoid signs and symptoms of disease, but patients, they want to function in a life and get on with their jobs, relationships, having children, functioning. And the two can be quite disconnected. And it's only by having those groups of people together that you get better science. We know that. You get better protocols, you get better endpoints, and you get better engagement. But for how many years we had clinical trials, and only now we're starting to get patients involved, and it's
even worse than that. They're completely disenfranchised. Who's paying for the treatment and the taxes and the patients? Where they're getting tested? The patients, because they're the most valued piece of the value chain, and they get no say, no decision about anything that goes on. Somebody else is always telling them what they can and can't do. So if it was just my decision, I would just stop. I said, I'm not going to go on any clinical trials. None of you can develop any of your therapeutics until you do it the way I want you to do it. Otherwise, forget it. You're going to be broke within months, because I'm not buying any of your drugs, and unless I absolutely have to, then I'm not going to stop going on to clinical trials as an individual. So how do we get all patients to not just the carrot, the stick to the whole system that says, you guys need to change because it's about us and it's not about you.
You get desperate patients, though, that will do anything and, you know, just to get on those trials at times. And I mean, some of the stipulations they put on us, we were never allowed to talk to each other. And you had no one to talk to when you felt really ill or certain things, and you weren't allowed to. It was just, unreasonable at times.
Picking up on what I think something Claire was saying earlier, very similar to what Vicky's saying now, is that regardless of trials, I think a lot of communication in medicine, we have this weird tendency to keep it very serious, very medicalised, and we feel that we somehow will be less credible if we don't add a human touch. And as you know, personally, I've tried communication in different ways using entertainment and so on, and it's really nice to sort of see somebody who's like, you know, obviously cracked it and done it in a great way. But you come across masses of resistance when you try to do something in a different way in some healthcare systems.
For those of you that haven't ever heard of Tapas, he's known as the singing doctor. And if you look at YouTube,
Can we hear a song?
he's on YouTube. I'm sure if you speak to Tapas at the end, I'm sure he'll be only too willing. Is that right?
Well, using that example, no bad came from it, but I came across a huge amount of resistance trying to introduce humour into how we communicate guidelines, and I suspect it's no different when you try to input a little bit of commercial thinking or make things a little bit more attractive in terms of making trials more appealing and easier to understand. Because that's something that we should be proud of being able to do. We, you know, as healthcare practitioners, one of the things I took pride in is taking really complex pieces of information and being able to explain it in a way that a layperson can understand. And we should really be, hopefully, doing that, you know, aspiring to do that with trials as well.
Which kind of brings me on to my next question, which I'm going to ask Max and Claire about. What could we be doing to help patients, partners, caregivers and HCPs understand more about clinical research and the role that it plays?
I think I did want to touch on something before.
No, please go back to
so
discuss.
I think that
not a problem.
what you said before was really interesting, because I think this seems like a massive communication issue from what I can gather, right? There's just lots of people in one camp who want something and loads of people who are scared of going over there because it seems like that bridge is too far for whatever reason, whether they're scared to go there because there's been this picture painted of these people sort of not making it through the trials or suddenly sort of dying in trials or whatever it is, the risk, basically. And I think that the whole point and the whole reason why you've got this trend shift to influencers and this way of actually talking to people is because they're more human, they're more related to the kids who are watching them, or there's so many channels of information now. You don't have to go and watch BBC One anymore. You can go and watch a weird Twitch channel and watch someone cook, you know. And I think the reason that what you said, Havas, about what you were potentially singing as a doctor is amazing, because you're humanising that process of even gathering information or the process of talking to patients. And I think that whole thing needs to be considered. The reason See Her Request was successful wasn't because we tried to make a horrible research project have achievements. It was because we built a video game that had science inside of it. And I think we took a video game and we did things behind the scenes that made it do science, and the messaging was there up front that you always get on a lot of things. It's not as bad as like a big T's and C's where you just go agree and you just start playing, but there's an element of people just wanting to get into that. The point is we did something that's familiar to people and they could interact, and they didn't have to change the way they interacted with it. And I think that is super powerful.
Andrew, from your perspective as a research fellow and chair of surgery, do you think gaming or sort of, did you say, was it kind of humanizing the whole?
Well, yeah, just instead of making the problem over here and the group of people who you need over here, and expecting them to come to you, you have to go to them, and you have to play ball in their court, because otherwise it's not going to work.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, this is the humanizing is one aspect of it, and I completely understand that. The other aspect is the doctor-patient interaction. That's why I like the singing component.
Yep.
People have always been taught how you should interact with your doctor, and then from a doc's perspective, I noticed once that I dropped my pen on the ground and went, oh shit. And then the patient was sitting in front of me, and they were just like completely diffused the situation. And I just did it every time almost, just to, the guy's not a weirdo. He's actually normal. He drops it and goes, oh shit, okay. And then this sort of way of diffusing things and just taking that formality out of it is really important. Then you can start having a really meaningful conversation with your patient, because they see you as a person, not as the doc.
Yeah, definitely.
Just picking up a couple of points there, I think like that idea of humanising it as well. Like even when you look at, Mark's got a great example of this, but like when you look at the adverts that are targeted for people to go and join it, it's like, are you 18 to 40? Do you have asthma? It's like you just can't imagine any kind of consumer brand going to people and having that kind of conversation. And as you say, there's the discussion bit of it as well. Is like, I don't think there's nearly enough done to arm people with the right questions, the right information to be asking for when they're going to talk to that doctor as well. And then suddenly you fall into that trap of like a slight hierarchy between the patient and the doctor, and an expectation that the doctor's going to bring all of these different options to you. And as Tapu was saying, you know, if you've been given a briefing of what trials are available 3 seconds before you see that patient, you know, it means both the patient and the doctor aren't really set to have the best conversation.
As I just add to that, I think we, outside of serious things like clinical trials, we judge every single company that we interact with every single day on really minor things. And we're allegedly presenting the forefront of innovation in science. This is like as good as it gets. And it's presented on like a scrap of paper with a list of criteria, and we wonder why patients are skeptical about whether we're really presenting the solution. Because it's like, if any brand offering you anything, in any scenario, you know, if a face cream was to be presented in such a way, no one would be wearing it.
Well, they make a lot of promises.
Yeah, and I think it's just understanding, like, humans don't make rational decisions. It's about understanding and communication, and those human things and those soft things, it's not part of the process in this kind of, all the good intentions are there, all the science is there, all the experts are there. What's missing is the simple stuff that seems unimportant, that I guess less sophisticated brands and less sophisticated people just get. And ultimately it's communication. And
well, I guess if you're talking about an advertising kind of, or a brand that advertises, they wouldn't be going, are you 18 to 40 and do you have asthma? They would know where to put that 18 to 40-year-old advert and be like, we're going to hang out where the 18 to 40-year-old people with asthma hang out. Yo, buy this product. Wouldn't they? They wouldn't be asking, they would already know. Yeah. Or they'd try different things.
What's the analogy you talk about, Mark, about Nike and the feet?
Yeah, we often have a mock-up we show just to dramatise it, which is, are you 18 to 45, do you have feet? Which is, because it's not even that we're just selling a trial. It's like, I've forgotten that there's even a benefit to you, you forget that these people have choice, and they're actually intelligent beings that they have things they're not just going, oh, this exists, therefore I'll come on it. And it's literally, if you see the way most things are presented, it's like, if you fit the criteria, you may be lucky enough to come into our store and purchase our product. And it's just, it's a complete, what it kind of completely misses is the exponential growth of trials. And that there's actually, I think we said 300,000 trials this year. Yeah. If you go back, I think 18 years ago, there were about 3,000. Wow. So there's this huge growth, which means patients have choice, but the industry hasn't moved with that. The industry still thinks that they're lucky to know one exists that they might fit the criteria of.
I'd go further than that, say it's actually hampering itself by some of its own regulations and frameworks. So, you know, as head of compliance, we're very highly regulated. and we want to be scientifically unbiased, and we need to be objective, and we've got codes of conduct. But it seems that by taking a legal safety angle, and because patient safety comes first, that has completely whitewashed everything in terms of effective communications and timely communications and bi-directional communications, because it's then deemed too hard to be compliant. And that's just simply not true. There are perverse incentives in place and infrastructures in place that actually we need to dismantle. So these ways of communicating, we want to take the best of the prosumer and consumer approach, but we need to apply it in a safe way, because it's about health outcomes and safety comes first. But we don't need to wait for a new invent. There's so many tools and approaches if you stitch them together in an effective way. And we've always done it that way. Well, you haven't. You've done it that way for the last 10 years, and you're just sticking to it because it's a change.
Vernon, could I challenge you with the safety comes first? Who said that? The patients didn't say that. Safety comes first to minimise exposure so it's the risk-benefit analysis. I think what I did for 25 years, I cut a person in half, ripped out half of their insides, stitched them all back together, and they had basically a 1 in 50 chance at best of never getting out of hospital alive. And so if you said safety first, I would never have made the incision. So
But even that conversation about risk, which comes back to education, healthcare, if you want healthcare, you have to be in it whilst you're well and when you're ill. And therefore you need to be in it from childhood, fundamentally.
And so this is at least to me, is the broader issue of why do we have this problem of how we put this out, this bit of paper? So what is it, you teach, you give a man a pair of shoes, and he's got a pair of shoes, or you give a whole bunch of people a pair of shoes, you teach him how to make shoes, and the whole city has shoes now. So what's causing that problem? And I think what you were touching on completely relates to that, because there's all this policy driven. I think most ethics committees around the world have basically lost their purpose, because they're policy committees to defend themselves against potential risk, rather than making the hard decision saying this clearly potentially benefits the population in a huge way, and the risk is well balanced, and it's worth the risk.
So to that, can I cite an example?
Of course, yeah, carry on.
2013, there's a great example where GSK partnered with Manchester, Salford Lung Study. This was a pre-license, so this was pre the drug being authorised, and they were doing their big randomised controlled trials. But because they had a platform where they had secondary care and primary care online, they could assess adverse events, so there were safety signals, quite rapidly. So it was deemed ethically sound that they could do a prospective trial, observational trial versus so a real-world evidence trial in the pre-license setting. And that was a first. That was 2013. That was one example. What was beautiful about that is the IP and the research platform was then owned by Manchester, the university and the researchers who could drive new research with other partners, and pharmaceutical industry had somebody to go to where they could do this real-world evidence. And it was only by having some simple IT infrastructure in place that was able to occur. And that's a perfect example of using real-world evidence as in combination. We'll never lose RCT trials and randomized control trials. They're fundamental, but we need them in combination with mixes of data sets and clinical trials. And we have to have a combination of those things. And the regulatory framework was years behind, basically.
Exactly. Most of the therapeutic development now occurs in the understanding what's the dose, the schedule, the right combination, etc. And their real-world evidence is where you find. And if you then you do your randomized control trial, and if you've looked at and found the right thing, you don't need 300, 400 patients. You just need 60 or 70 patients, because you're looking for this sort of difference. If there's going to be this much difference, we can't afford it. The net benefit the pharmaceutical industry brings to is almost zero, based on how much we expend energy, effort in developing things, and the benefit for humankind is starting to dwindle relative to the investment. So how do we change that? And it's risk-benefit analysis, but the people that should be involved in this are basically blocked out, which are the participants and us as a community, if that makes sense.
Just to add, I think that when you talk about the safety thing, which it always ends up being the kind of focus, for me the real gap is empathy. And it's actually understanding, and what I find so sad about that is that every single person in this entire industry that I speak to fundamentally cares about what they're doing. They care about the patients. It's not a commercial kind of thing that they're looking to achieve. They really believe in what they're doing to help people. But empathy kind of comes by design, not by accident. And communications is a skill, it's a science in itself that requires design and planning. And I think so much of the process is designed around the safety and the science and the structure. But we haven't designed empathy into that structure. We haven't designed the right moments to communicate with people, the right information to give them. And I guess ultimately what we're talking about is involving patients and understanding what their needs are and how we can help them is kind of half that battle.
And the only way we'll do that is if we ask them.
Yep. On that note, on an empathy note, do we think we do enough to support patients' needs outside of medical treatment?
Right.
Empathy, transport costs, etc. Who wants to open that one? Vicky?
Personally, no, not in my experience. And obviously different trials, different patients, but with the Parkinson's community, we had to come off all our treatment, so you were like, well, when you're parkified, you literally can't move, you can't walk, you get something called dystonia, which is you're in agony, and you're expected to stay in a hotel. Sometimes you had to go on your own, and trying to even get ready, trying to get your knickers on, even for goodness sake, to get into the hospital was just a nightmare. And there was nobody always to come with me. They certainly didn't pay people to come with me. And some of the trips home and there were just hell, absolute hell.
I think it sort of varies, doesn't it? I think in paediatrics there's probably more support, but it's support to a point. It's not, they don't often look at the whole family. Sophie, my daughter, was asked to be on a trial. We lived an hour and 20 minutes from Alderhay. This was before I worked there. She wanted to be part of that trial. The trial started a month before her GCSEs. So they want this group of children. Who thought that was a good idea? They, you know, at the time, and you can't have children sitting their GCSEs, being part of a trial. I know everybody's got their own agendas, of course they have, but again, back to communication. But then I was, you know, if it had been another time of the year, I would have been able to get her there because I had a car, I could have driven her there. If I'd had 3 other children at home and worked full time, again, the logistics of it all, would childcare have been provided, would transport have been provided? It's just so complex and it's just so different in everybody's situation.
And to Mark's point, you know, I don't think these things are done maliciously
No,
per se. It's just a lack of common sense, isn't it? It's like there's that horrible story of people that were going on an ovarian cancer trial and their waiting room was in the same place as a maternity ward, and they, you know, they're going in. And I don't think anyone sat there and gone, oh, that's going to be a horrible situation, I'll make it happen. But no one sat there either and gone, that's a horrible situation, let's make sure that never happens. And it's just a lack of sight on it and common sense and application to that. And to your point, like, it only takes asking one patient their thoughts on that trial design, the way it's approached, to help avoid a situation like that.
Is that partially to do with how long things take to get approved? Because from what I understand from the industry is that you always aim for a date and it always gets pushed back, and then there's loads of delays, and then probably the GCSE thing was they just went, this is the first time we can do it. So at that point in time, it's not but it's so it doesn't even make sense. So I guess it comes back to the red tape a bit, you know, really getting in the way of a lot of this stuff.
But it's simple, but, you know, taking a methodical approach to those little, you know, when you add up all those holes in the bucket, that's a lot of leak in the system. Whether it's just simple things about carpool sharing, whether it's process, whether it's about setting expectations, incentivizing, because you do it just for the potential benefit of maybe randomly being on the drug of the active ingredient without knowing what. So this whole ethos, you know, this whole notion that you do it for your own benefit, there's a potential benefit, but we've got to keep, you've got to actively incentivize people to do it. It's not good enough. We know that even on, you know, heart failure or cancer trials, it's not enough to know that your health is at risk by not participating or taking a treatment. We have to actively incentivize people. And that's in the way we talk, the way we act, and the process.
I mean, this transport and individual participant support really worries me, because a cancer trial costs between 100 and 200 or 1,000 or even more per patient on trial. So if one of your participants doesn't turn up, halfway through their trial, then it's just like, well, why not send them a helicopter? It's still going to be cheaper.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You know,
I think that's what it comes down to. It's the money that it costs to support people more effectively isn't relevant to the billions of dollars at play. It just comes down to
Or lost.
central. It kind of. So we work on global trials across. It's like 46 countries. It's being managed by a small team in one place, making broad assumptions about the world.
Yeah.
And it kind of comes down to the fact that it's really difficult to arrange transport in 46 countries. So it's easier not to. It's not. If someone presents the solution and says, can you just pay for it? That's great, but it's kind of like we're looking at using, say in the States, you can use Uber. And it's like for $50 you can get someone to their appointment. Even though on a trial you may get the money reimbursed, it might take 4 or 5 months for that money to come back to you, by which point how many trips or how many hotels have you fronted? There's people not taking part in trials because they just can't afford it. But the drug that these few hundred people are going to release might be worth billions in the first year.
I certainly think with the Parkinson's patients, we recommended having like a mentor buddy system, that there would be a group of people that would be able to go with patients and help them, even if it is things like dressing them or helping them walk to the car, because it's pretty bad at times.
I can certainly empathise. I mean, I don't know that I didn't tell you guys, but I've actually had Parkinson's for 42 years, now into my 43rd year. And if I was to go on a clinical trial and be taken off my meds, I've had brain surgery as well, if I had to switch my DBS off, without help and without assistance, I wouldn't be able to do virtually anything. It's thanks to having the system switched on in the first place that I can actually function. So no, I totally agree with you there. But how can we improve it? In your opinion, Vicky?
I think listening to patients who've been on trials, getting their feedback and listening to it and acting on that feedback, not just paying it lip service.
Yeah.
Just trying to get, I think, just have more empathy. I think, like how you were saying with like legislations and stuff, I think people sometimes get wrapped up with what needs to be done and like writing the protocol, this and this. And then I think sometimes people forget maybe that it's the patient, they've got to get there. So if you could have home visits, or even, I know it brings in a whole new headache of kind of the drug temperatures and all stuff like that, but to administer maybe sometimes some drugs at home, and these patients are feeling really horrible as it is, just that slight change would probably make a big difference to...
I think that's something we're going to come on to later, isn't it? Home sort of...
I think it's just one thing. I think it's the timing of when you ask those patients, which is crucial. And that's what we see all the time with Generation R in Liverpool. If you get the researcher to come to you at that early stage of protocol, that must save them so much money. My goodness me.
Yeah. Do you think it's something that you could introduce as part of a curriculum? As part of a curriculum, an introduction to sort of looking after yourself, the potential of clinical trials, maybe at a young age. For example, Professor Andrew, would you go into a school, for example, and do a talk about the benefits of clinical trials too?
Yeah.
I mean, is that the way forward? What do people feel about that? Is that...
Well, it is for me. Before I came into the industry, it was something I knew nothing about, and it's so fundamental to so many things that we rely on as humans. I mean, I've not used pi once in my entire life since leaving school.
But Claire knows 33.
We use it in every conversation.
But it is, you've got to reach out to the community. Alder Hey are really good at doing that in Liverpool. We go out to like the festivals, we go out to all the street markets. Some of our scientists and researchers go out with lots and lots of hands-on stuff so that kids are so excited about it. Like, what happens if I mix this colour and that colour? This is children 4 or 5 with coming, I've been a researcher badge, and they're suddenly just hearing those terms, hearing those words for the first time.
Do you think that would encourage not only people to participate in clinical trials, but to get involved as scientists as well? Because obviously, the world needs scientists, and would it encourage people to get involved?
We'd hope so. I mean, I was talking, I can't remember who I was mentioning it to, I think it was to you, saying that 2 of our young members of our group who joined us when they were 9, one's at Imperial College London studying medicine now, and another is at Nottingham. So it really, getting involved in research at a young, age, and also being given training into it all, not just sort of having it thrown at them, but being given the right training, which they have had, is really changed things for them for a lifetime.
Something that I think maybe Mark said this a long time ago about we really celebrate in the press and the media when a new molecule is discovered. And after that, there is this sort of complete lack of communication. I've often been on the receiving end of that situation when a patient with a chronic disease comes in with a newspaper cutting saying, I want to know more about this. And as a practicing doctor, not as an academic doctor, but as a clinical doctor, you don't know about the molecules. You don't have a sort of pipeline information being fed to you. It's something that I've really learned about since joining at Havas. And so inevitably you admit you don't know about it, and that it's probably something in very early stages and not really relevant to their immediate treatment. I don't know what else I could have done in that situation, but wouldn't it have been amazing if that same press release just simply has something like, if you're interested and want to find more, join a mailing list or something along those lines. Or going back to what Sammy's saying, that from a young age, what if we all knew what to do when you see that? Because there's a trial hotline, or you just know how to handle that situation as a member of the public.
That even happens into no matter how expert you are, and people will come in and, oh, what about this new thing for pancreatic cancer? What do you think of that? And I go, I've never bloody heard of this. And then I go, well, I've never heard of it. Let's look it up. So I pull out my phone, do a Google search, and go, oh, they've cured a few cells in a dish. So
I hate hearing those things in the media though, because when you're newly diagnosed with anything, you just look for the answer. You want the magic cure, and you get so hyped up about these things, and then I never bother looking them up now.
Have you seen the new one, #in mice? So whenever a new piece of research is put out by the media purporting it's cure. In mice, mice, amazing things. We can do.
They are.
But the media's got a massive thing, about engaging people and about you see a lot of this for the consumer world, from the health and wellness, but actually people are not health literate, and they're not engaged. They're not because for a number of reasons. But we've got 65 million people that are plugged in to electronic. We could potentially be at the forefront of research on a multitude of different ways in this country, not just for the NHS, but also for international research. And part and parcel of that is capturing people's hearts and minds, right, and getting them involved and engaged, and why you need to be part of that process. It's just that's the norm. Not, I'm at the end of my tether, I'm looking for some rare and wonderful cure to something. And that has to be part of the positive, using the psychology in the gaming industry and being part of a community, the citizen science angle.
There's a similar thing there with the game, because I always tell people, everyone thinks, oh, so you play this game and it tells you if you have dementia. No, it does not do that. That would be really, if that was ever possible, it would be so far down the line. But there was even, I really struggle with sort of like sensationalist journalism for those exact reasons, because there was even a case where, See Here Request, when it first came out, was doing sort of gangbusters in that sort of in the news, and it picked up a lot of media attention. But I had an email from this Brazilian newspaper or Brazilian TV station, and they did a phone interview with me, and it was all sort of last minute, and they wouldn't give me any preparation. And the first thing I was live on air and on a Brazilian TV station, said, "So you've solved dementia with this video game?" And I said, "No, we have not solved dementia with this video game." "So how many people have you diagnosed with dementia?" "None. This is not what it's about. You haven't done your research." And then the phone was like, quickly cut to a commercial break.
A lot of patients in Brazil want See Here Request, clearly.
There's demand for it over there.
Can you imagine the demand, though, going back to the doctors? They will have been, battering the doors down of those doctors saying, "Look at this guy in England, and it's that sensationalist thing that just gets me so angry when you read the front of certain newspapers and it says if you eat broccoli 3 times a week, your eczema will be cured. And my mum, ironically, is the worst person for believing all of that rubbish. And look at this, and I put it in the bin.
But there's no place for that hyperbole in healthcare. Actually, it's about the mundane, it's about the everyday, it's about the little things that make a massive difference. Yes, you've got aspirations, but It's about helping in little pragmatic and practical ways, and that's the collective benefit, isn't it?
The informed consent process. What are your experience of this, and why is this a stumbling block in recruitment of patients to trials? I'm going to begin with you, Vicky, obviously because you've been on a trial quite recently.
I think when I agreed to go on, well, I rang the hospital up and said, basically, can I come on this trial? And they needed 6 people initially, and I was the 6th person. I really wasn't in a proper state of mind. I would have done and signed anything. I practically skipped a theatre because I was not really, I don't think I really knew what I was letting myself in for. If I'm honest now.
Have you ever thought when patients have come on trials, that's been the case, they've been that desperate, they'd go on for any reason? Even whatever, you could tell them, I don't know, you could tell them a big story and they'd believe it because they were that desperate to get.
So, I mean, that's not an easy question to answer because you do get that perception,
yeah,
or often the patient's family, not just for clinical trials, just for any sort of therapeutic. And so if you think about who are you treating, who are you looking after, and what are sometimes the best decision is to say you've done everything you can.
Yeah.
And it's pancreatic cancer. Most of my patients died, and a couple of situations I remember was one patient with a family was really pushing for things to happen, and was for off-label and other different therapies. And when he actually spoke to the patient, he said, "How much is it going to cost?" And I told him X amount. He goes, "Look, I'd rather leave that to my grandkids and spend it on this because you're telling me it's almost not going to work," etc. And as a health system, particularly in cancer, most of the expense, there's just no benefit. 70% of any health budget is spent on the last 9 months of life. That means it's not working, and we don't understand how to approach don't have treatment. You always have to do something. And that's a very difficult, I don't know the answer to that. You can cope with that at an individual level, but as a community, how do you deal with that particular scenario? It has such a huge impact on the economics of healthcare delivery.
Sammy, how does it work with younger children?
Well, I've got a personal experience that when Sophie, and as a family, but it was very much led by Sophie, she was 14, wanted to be part of a trial. I think it was done in a very calm and probably the best way because she'd been diagnosed, we'd had a couple of weeks to digest the information. We were sat with a lupus specialist nurse from Lupus UK, who were amazing, and it was just explained as perfectly as it could be. So that was a good experience for us, but I know I was very lucky with that. I now work with parents who are having to sign forms as their children are being whipped into an operating theatre because they're having a huge, big cardiac arrest and need to have open heart surgery. So I know a very good friend of mine now has had to do that at least 3 times. So you're not making an informed consent, are you? No. You're absolutely up the wall. You're a parent. Your child could potentially die, and you will sign anything to get them to have that thing. But then very, very often with our groups, we look at patient information sheets to do with clinical trials that are 50, 60 pages long. And you might have a parent whose grasp of English might not be that good, their reading age might not be that high, and you're giving them a great big document in black and white, tiny words, that have a read of that. And now you should, in the best case scenario, have somebody to explain that in lay terms and everything else. But does that always happen?
Just even a YouTube video with an electronic consent.
Exactly.
I mean, it's pretty straightforward. It's not rocket science, is it?
It's not at all. And we've had a lot of researchers come in with those, showing them to our young people. What do you think of it? And they're fantastic. So why can't it all be simple?
And do it at home. You've got here's the link. Have a look at it. Here's this. Here's that. You can mull it over. Show your friends. What do you think of this, guys? And etc.
But it goes back to the legal side of everything that you were saying before. They say no, there's not enough information. we need to get all legal, we're covering ourselves, etc., etc.
We're not the only industry, though, that's got really in-depth legal
No,
information that
not
needs to
at
go
all.
through.
No,
like,
no.
There's the great example of the British Airways safety ad before you take off, where they've taken really boring, complex legal information and put it in a way that's nice and engaging.
Yeah.
As you say, like, it doesn't take much. It's just a YouTube video, something that helps make it a little bit more digestible, a little bit more memorable.
But just going back to the outcomes, though, so doing nothing is compliant, right? It's just ethically unacceptable, and from a business case, it makes no sense. So you've got to pick your arguments, and you've got to pick the ethical reasons. You've got to pick the business case behind it as well. And so again, tackling methodically the challenges might be a different approach to showing that a solution works. And actually, one size doesn't fit all. We've said that in the way that we want to approach patients, and we want to approach how we engage with them and how we work with them on trials. So we should think about different ways of tackling, if it's process and infrastructure problems in one place rather than more of a comms approach somewhere else.
I think the challenge
there isn't one simple.
The way it's approached is that there is that kind of, like you say, as long as it's got everything in it, then we've covered it. But I guess the only thing we know is that people don't read these things. So they end up, like Vicky mentioned, that technically it's there, but we've done a disservice because we've got them to sign something. I'm sure we all, did I read every page of my mortgage or my credit card or any of those things? Probably not. I just assumed it probably, they had to follow the laws, so it would probably be all right. And I think if you're going through that process for most things, it's okay. But in this, when you're then going to find out you're getting adverse events or you're getting procedures you weren't expecting, it's a short-term problem because it's great because our recruitment numbers have happened, but then there's a huge problem with people dropping off for trials. And the easiest, what we kind of find is the easiest way for someone to accept a problem later down the line is to understand it's coming. And when you're surprised by things that probably were in this document somewhere, if we've not, and I guess the things like British Airways and things that other companies do is that, I went to a bank and when I did my mortgage, they made me sit and watch a video, which was like 3 minutes, which was the key things. I still had the document. It was a huge document to sign, which I didn't read. I think they walked away and left me an appropriate amount of time to read it, and I chatted to my wife and ignored it. But the video was there to ensure that I understood at the right reading level the facts I needed to take out. I don't think we shoot ourselves in the foot by not taking that.
This is really important. So for Precision Pank, we want to get more and more patients onto the study, at least get it out there. But we're dependent upon the clinician and the clinician's time, and then the chucking of the information sheet and the consent form. So, I mean, for us, if there was some electronic media that, rather than actually going through this process, having to have a formal consultation.
And also the consent process is very variable depending on who does it because of the human, variability. I've seen some consent forms which I struggle to read even though I know what the procedure is, and others which are beautifully thorough, and I always used to think that I aspire to do that, but time sort of limits how much you can say. But we're all taught to legally for consent to work, the person has to have all the information which is deemed appropriate, and then be able to make that decision without coercion. But then one of the downfalls is something I experienced myself. So a couple of weeks ago, my little infant son needed some abdominal surgery, and we knew he needed this procedure for a few months, and we signed a consent form. 5 minutes before he went to the operation theatre, we saw the anaesthetist for the first time, who then said that it is a general anaesthetic and we'd signed consent for that, but she also needed to do a spinal operation. A spinal procedure for the anaesthetic, for a localised anaesthetic. And even though me and my wife both sort of trained doctors and quite experienced, kind of threw us. Because we're not at this stage going to say, well, don't do the operation. So we just signed the form, but we've both felt incredibly uncomfortable having known that there's a tiny, tiny, tiny risk of paralysis or permanent numbness and so on. And it just, for that hour that he was in the operating theatre, we were thinking of nothing else. Like, what if he comes back and he can't move his legs and so on? And it would have just been so easy. We had 6 months of operation, notice of this procedure. It would have been so easy to have that conversation earlier. And so it's not just clinical trials, it's everything. Loads of procedures happen every day in a less than optimal way, unfortunately.
Right, we'll have to move on to the next question, but thanks for that, Tap. Are there any industries or companies outside of pharma that you think we can learn from in terms of their approach to the patient experience? Nick?
Yeah, so throughout this whole discussion, I've been thinking of how things like you were saying that can just bring it back up to time. So I'm on Facebook quite a lot. I'm ashamed to admit it. But
I met my wife on Facebook.
Oh, but quite often you'll chat to someone about something. So an example, I was talking with Eva about getting my kids scooters for Christmas. What scooter should I get? And then Facebook started showing me scooters. I was like, how the hell do they know about this? And I spoke to my husband, and he was like, it's artificial intelligence. And I was like, what? They're listening to me. And now since he started, because he knows quite a bit about it, since he started saying about artificial intelligence and all things like that, I notice it so much more now that things are marketed to me based on what I Google, based on what I talk about, and like even things like clinical trials, could you potentially pop up?
Selective marketing.
Yeah, and just like even after this call, I don't know, maybe our phones are on now and they're listening to us. Like when I go back on my phone, will Facebook pop up with something or other about? And I just think maybe that's an industry that might help with getting people to understand clinical trials a little bit better. And just like we touched on earlier, that people only really know about clinical trials when you're poorly or when you really need it. Whereas if you understood it back at school and stuff, when you necessarily don't need it, it's an option that you can look at.
But when 1 in 4 searches on Google are health-related, they should be coming straight up with, not just disease state, but clinical trials.
Would you trust
literacy?
Would you trust the pop-ups?
Whose responsibility is it?
It is.
I mean, we have to come in there with trust, but Pandora's box has been opened. There's no getting away from that. We have to work with those and I'm all for getting rid of the monopolies. And some big search engines are part of that problem. But we have to work with them or provide alternative.
But quite often we're marketed to, aren't we, without realising we are. Even though I know it's completely not related to marketing, but in Darren Brown, if you've ever been to one of his shows, he plants things without you even realising you're reading it. And then the reason he's not a mind reader, he says he's not psychic, he's not magic, but it's because he plants things. So like you said, you may not trust them, but without realising you're learning more about these clinical trials without realising you're learning more about them. So that's one way to...
In terms of the trust thing as well, I suppose potentially you could kite mark certain things so that if you saw the kite mark, you'd trust it. Or I'm thinking something along the lines of when I browse on Amazon, for example, and I want something quite generic, let's say, like, I don't know, I can't think of anything I buy on Amazon now, but I'm always on there. Let's say I bought a humidifier recently. So you can get sort of thousands of like unbranded ones, but my eye will look out for the one that says Philips or the one that, a recognizable company. So I suppose if there was a reputable few brands that are doing this, you would learn to trust.
True. I mean, if you're looking at Cancer Research UK comes up, then you trust it.
You automatically are
NHS
reassured
comes up, you
that
trust it.
And my thing with the NHS comes up and we say, wow. But so many people, will say to me, so who do you work for? I say, I work for the NIHR. Oh, who's that? What company's that? And they don't realise. And that's even with all the branding and all the marketing and all the I am research and all of that. It's still not as well known as everyone says NHS and waves the flag, don't they? And it's great, but it's,
Ladies, we have 5 minutes left, and in that time, it's gone really, really quickly. Right, in the last 5 minutes, I'm just going to go around the room and ask you all, can you give us one simple change you would make to improve the patient experience within clinical trials? Starting with Sammy.
To improve the literature that is given out, connected to clinical trials, and to get families and young people involved at the very early stage of planning.
Yeah, building on that a little bit. I mean, for me, I love the story of Amazon. Whenever they have a board meeting, they have an empty chair, and that empty chair is the customer. Like, that's got to be the way that we approach clinical trials, is that we've got an empty chair which is filled with a patient, a caregiver, and someone that's actually going to be the person who experiences the clinical trial.
Max?
I think with the experience in Sea Hero Quest and other projects, I think there needs to be some kind of feedback loop, between collecting information or something like an interaction with a doctor or something that eventually leads to the person on the other end finding out more information about what's going on, and then it feeds itself, you know. I think that was the biggest request from what we did. People want to know what's the outcome of me being part of this research, and I think that could be done in micro stages through projects or trials or anything.
Fantastic. Andrew?
To me, it comes back to the value piece. It's what you're willing to accept as an individual. If you've got incremental benefit, you're not going to put up with these sorts of things. But if you've got some sort of feeling or thinking or understanding that actually there is benefit, not just for me, but for my community, and your ethos is approaching that, thinking about where are the value components, the individual value, the value to the community, and then thinking about it more broadly, saying what about the value for UK PLC? We have a vibrant life sciences sector, but we have a great NHS, which is all unified, the world's best place to do clinical trials, yet we can't build on that value. For how many years did the UK pay the United States for the patent for penicillin when it was invented here? Multiple opportunities like that to think about, well, I'm doing this not just for my benefit and this sort of ethereal benefit, I'm also doing it for the benefit of the country, I'm doing it for the benefit of healthcare in the future. We want to move towards something like a self-sustaining NHS. So I have all these other reasons to be part of this, not just for my individual gain, which is important, but we don't project that thinking it's for the benefit of Pfizer or for the benefit of Roche or something like that. Is the perception, when in reality it's all of us.
Thank you. Nick?
I think just consideration more for the patient. I think sometimes we get, legislations and stuff and regulations get wrapped up in how things should work for the safety, but really you should be thinking about how it's going to work for them, and basically you want to see them get better, so their consideration really.
I'm going to go to Vernon next because I'm going to end with Mark. Vernon?
I'm going to go with the empathy, engagement, entertainment. It doesn't matter whether you're a researcher or a patient or a carer or a manager in a health system. We can entertain and engage and make things interesting. We've got to make it exciting, right? It can seem very ponderous and methodical and technical and complex. But healthcare is about, everything revolves around healthcare and about being well. So why not add some of that level of interest and entertainment?
Vicky?
To simply listen to patients and act upon what they tell them.
Thank you. Tap?
Similar to what Vernon was going to say, actually, about the entertainment, or education through entertainment. So a nice example of this that I came across was they raised HIV awareness in South Africa through a sort of Neighbours, Hollyoaks-style TV program called Sun City, and there's a opportunity, I think, to do that for healthcare as well.
And finally, Mark.
For me, it's about kind of going back to basics. I think there's a lot of the industries looking at data, technology, big, sexy subjects, because it feels like a big problem. I don't know if we touched on that. 80% of trials generally struggle to find patients on time. And then most of those can't retain patients. And we're looking at these high-level problems, high-level solutions to this problem, but it's really, when you look at it, it's going back to basics. It's involving and understanding the people that it's about. It's looking at basic communication, and the one thing that we always go back to, and we showed at the kind of launch of the white paper, is how impossible it is for a patient who is motivated to get any information. And one of the things we always do is phone up most of the top 10 pharma companies to try and find out a bit of information about a trial and how to get onto them. And it is next to impossible to do that. And if you look at consumer brands, they know how to sell things. They know how to respond in a customer service manner. And when you want to, if you want to complain about something, you get put to the long wait. When you want to buy something, you immediately get an answer on the phone. They just get that. The industry's not realised that its biggest customer and the most important person is the patients. They need to gear around how they support their experience, sort of end to end.
And that seems a suitable place to end the conversation. Ladies and gents, thank you very much for coming down and joining in the conversation. And I hope you've got as much out of it as certainly I have. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.